Good day, good day. Grand risings to anybody that's here. And good day, good afternoon, good evening. And welcome to anybody that's watching on a replay. Let's see, it's telling me, restream's telling me that nobody's watching. So this one's going out to all those watching on a replay. We're going to continue with the Book of the Damned by Mr. Charles Fort. I got to the Kentucky Phenomenon yesterday, so I'm going to continue reading the Kentucky Phenomenon. TW, hey mate, hi, good to see you. I want to put some piano music, some piano in the background. Probably means there's going to be adverts, but right. The Kentucky Phenomenon. So it was called in its day, and now we have an occurrence that attracted a great deal of attention in its own time. Usually, these things of the accursed have been hushed up or disregarded, suppressed, like the 7 black rains of Slains. But upon March 3rd, 1876, something occurred in Bath County, Kentucky, that brought many newspaper correspondents to that scene. The substance that looked like beef that fell from the sky. Upon March 3rd, 1876, at Olympian Springs, Bath County, Kentucky, flakes of a substance that looked like beef fell from the sky, from a clear sky. We'd like to emphasize that it was said that nothing but this falling substance was visible in the sky. It fell in flakes of various sizes, some 2 inches square, 1, 3, or 4 inches square. The flake formation is interesting. Later, we shall think of it as signifying pressure somewhere. It was a thick shower on the ground, on trees, on fences, but it was narrowly localized, or upon a strip of land about 100 yards long and about 50 yards wide. For the first account, see the Scientific American 34-197 and the New York Times, March 10th, 1876. Then the exclusionists. Something that looked like beef. 1 flake of it the size of a square envelope. If we think of how hard the exclusionists have fought to reject the coming of ordinary-looking dust from this Earth's externality, we can sympathize with them in this sensational instance, perhaps. Newspaper correspondents wrote broadcast and witnesses were quoted. And this time there is no mention of a hoax, and, except by one scientist, there is no denial that the fall did take place. It seems to me that the exclusionists are still more emphatically conservators. It is not so much that they are inimical to all data of externally derived substances that fall from upon this earth, as that they are inimical to all data discordant with a system that does not include such phenomena, or the spirit of hope or ambition of the cosmos, which we call attempted positivism, not to find out the new, not to add what is called knowledge, but to systematize. Scientific American Supplement 2-426, that the substance reported from Kentucky had been examined by Leopold Brandeis. Quote, "At last we have a proper explanation of this much talked about phenomenon." End quote. Quote, "It has been comparatively easy to identify the substance and to fix its status. The Kentucky wonder is no more or less than Nostoc." End quote. Or that it had not fallen, or that it had been upon the ground in the first place, and had swollen in rain, and attracting attention by greatly increased volume, had been supposed by unscientific observers to have fallen in the rain. What rain? I don't know. Also, it is spoken of as dried several times. That's one of the most important of the details. Red Eye Jedi, how you doing, mate? Grand Rising. But the relief of outraged propriety expressed in the supplement is amusing to some of us who, I fear, may be a little improper at times. Very spirit of the Salvation Army, when some third-rate scientist comes out with an explanation of the vermiform appendix or the os coccygis, I don't know how to say that, COCCYGIS, that would have been acceptable to Moses, to give completeness to the, quote, the proper explanation, end quote. It is said that Mr. Brandeis had identified the substance as flesh-coloured nostoc. Professor Lawrence Smith of Kentucky, one of the most resolute of the exclusionists, New York Times, March 12, 1876, that the substance had been examined and analysed by Professor Smith, according to whom it gave every indication of being the dried spawn of some reptile, doubtless of the frog, or up from one place and down another. As to dried, that may refer to a condition when Professor Smith received it. In the Scientific American Supplement 2-473, Dr. A. Mead Edwards, president of the New York Scientific Association, writes that when he saw Mr. Brandeis's communication, his feeling was of conviction that propriety had been re-established, or that the problem had been solved. As he expresses it, knowing Mr. Brandeis well, he had called upon that holder of respectability to see the substance that had been identified as nostoc. But he had also called upon Dr. Hamilton, who had a specimen, and Dr. Hamilton had declared it to be lung tissue. Dr. Edwards writes of the substance that had so completely or beautifully, if beauty is completeness, been identified as nostoc. Quote, "It turns out to be lung tissue also," end quote. He wrote to other persons who had specimens and identified other specimens as masses of cartilage or muscle fibers. Quote, "As to whence it came, I have no theory," end quote. Nevertheless, he endorses the local explanation, and a bizarre thing it is. A flock of gorged, heavy-weighted buzzards, but far up and invisible in the clear sky, they had disgorged. Professor Fuzzik lists the substance in his bibliography as fish spawn. McCarthy, in the Monthly Weather Review 1918, May 1918, lists it as a jelly-like material, supposed to have been the dried spawn either of fishes or some batrachian. Or this is why, against the seemingly insuperable odds, against all things new, there can be what is called progress. That nothing is positive in the aspects of homogeneity and unity. If the whole world should seem to combine against you, it is only unreal combination, or intermediateness to unity and disunity. Every resistance is itself divided into parts resting one another. Resisting one another. Sorry, reading it live again, remember. Every resistance is itself divided into parts resisting one another. The simplest strategy seems to be never bother to fight a thing. Set its own parts fighting one another. We are merging away from carnal to gelatinous substance, and here there is an abundance of instances or reports of instances. These data are so improper, they're obscene to the science of today, but we shall see that science, before it became so rigorous, was not so prudish. Chladni was not, and Greg was not. I shall have to accept myself that gelatinous substance has often fallen from the sky, or that far up or far away the whole sky is gelatinous, that meteors tear through and detach fragments, that fragments are brought down by storms, that the twinkling of stars is penetration of light through something that quivers. I think myself that it would be absurd to say that the whole sky is gelatinous. It seems more acceptable that only certain areas are. Humboldt in Cosmos 1-119 says that all our data in this respect must be, quote, classed amongst the mythical fables of mythology, end quote. He is very sure, but just a little redundant. We shall be opposed by the standard resistances. There, in the first place, up from one place, in a whirlwind, and down another. I shall not bother to be very convincing one way or another, because of the overshadowing of the datum with which we shall end up. It will mean that something had been in a stationary position for several days over a small part of a town in England. This is the revolutionary thing that we have alluded to before. Whether the substance were nostoc or spawn, or some kind of larval nexus, doesn't matter so much. If it stood in the sky for several days, we rank with Moses as a chronicler of improprieties. Or was that story or datum, we mean, told by Moses? Then we shall have so many records of gelatinous substance said to have fallen with meteorites that, between the two phenomena, some of us will have to accept connection, or that there are at least vast gelatinous areas aloft, and that meteorites tear through, carrying down some of the substance. Comptus Rendus 3-554. That in 1836, M. Vallet, member of the French Academy, placed before the Academy some fragments of a gelatinous substance, said to have fallen from the sky, and asked that they be analysed. There is no further allusion to this subject. Comptus Rendus 23-542. That in Wilna, Lithuania, April 4th, 1846, in a rainstorm, fell nut-sized masses of a substance that is described as both resinous and gelatinous. It was odourless until burned, then it spread a very pronounced sweetish odour. It is described as like gelatin, but much firmer. But having been in water for 24 hours, it swelled out and looked altogether gelatinous. It was grey. It was greyish. We are told that in 1841 and 1846, a similar substance had fallen in Asia Minor. In Notes and Queries 8-6-190, it is said that early in August 1894, thousands of jellyfish, about the size of a shilling, had fallen at Bath, England. I think it is not acceptable that they were jellyfish, but it does look as if this time frog spawn did fall from the sky, and may well have been translated by a whirlwind, because at the same time small frogs fell in Wigan, England. Nature 87-10, that the 24th of June 1911 at Eton, Buckinghamshire, London, the ground was found covered with masses of jelly the size of peas after a heavy rainfall. We are not told of nostoc this time. It is said that the subject contained numerous eggs of some species of Chironomus, from which the larvae soon emerged. I incline then to think that the objects that fell at Bath were neither jellyfish nor masses of frog spawn, but something of a larval kind. This is what had occurred at Bath, England, 23 years before. The London Times, April 24th, 1871. That, upon the 22nd of April, 1871, a storm of glutinous drops, neither jellyfish nor masses of frog spawn, but something of a... There's a line missing in the original text. Railroad station at Bath. Quote, many soon developed into a worm-like chrysalis, about an inch in length, end quote. This account of the occurrence in the Zoologist 2-6-2686 is more like the Eton datum of minute forms said to have been infusoria, not forms about an inch in length. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out what these abbreviations are now. The Transatlantic ENT Society of London, 1871, that the phenomenon has been investigated by the Reverend L. Jennings of Bath. His description is of minute worms in filmy envelopes. He tries to account for their segregation. The mystery of it is, what could have brought so many of them together? Many other falls we shall have record of, and in most of them segregation is the great mystery. A whirlwind seems anything but a segregative force. Segregation of things that have fallen from the sky has been avoided, as most deep died of the damned. Mr. Jennings conceives of a large pool in which were many of these spherical masses, of the pool drying up and concentrating in a small area, of a whirlwind then scooping all up together. But several days later, more of these objects fell in the same place. That such marksmanship is not attributable to whirlwinds seems to me to be what we think we mean by common sense. It may not look like common sense to say that these things have been stationary over the town of Bath for several days. The 7 black rains of Slains, the 4 red rains of Siena. The interesting sidelight on the mechanics of orthodoxy is that Mr. Jennings dutifully records the second fall, but ignores in it his explanation. R.P. Gregg, one of the most notable cataloguers of meteoritic phenomena, records falls of a viscid substance in the years 1652, 1686, 1718, 1796, 1811, 1819, and 1844. He gives earlier dates, but I practice exclusions myself. In the report of the British Association 1860 to 63, Gregg records a meteor that seemed to pass near the ground, near Barsdorf and Freiburg, Germany. The next day, a jelly-like mass was found in the snow. Unseasonableness for either spawn or nostoc. Gregg's comment in this instance is, quote, curious if true, end quote, but he records without modification the fall of a meteorite at Gotha, Germany, September 6th, 1835, quote, leaving a jelly-like mass on the ground, end quote. We are told that this substance fell only 3 feet away from an observer. In the report of the British Association 1855-94, according to a letter from Gregg to Professor Baden-Powell at night, October 8th, 1844, near Koblenz, a German who was known to Gregg and another person saw a luminous body fall close to them. They returned next morning and found a gelatinous mass of greyish colour. According to Chladni's account, a viscous mass fell with a luminous meteorite between Siena and Rome. In May 1652, viscous matter found after the fall of a fireball in Lusatia. March 1796, fall of a gelatinous substance after the explosion of a meteorite near Heidelberg, July 1811. In the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal 1-234, the substance that fell at Lusatia is said to have been of the colour and odour of dried brown varnish. In the American Scientific Journal, it is said that a gelatinous matter fell with a globe of fire upon the island of Lethe, India. In the American Science Journal, in many observations upon the meteors of November 1833 are reports of falls of gelatinous substance that, according to the newspaper reports, quote, lumps of jelly, end quote, were found at the ground in Rahway, New Jersey. The substance was whitish or resembled a coagulated white of an egg. That Mr. H. Garland of Nelson County, Virginia, had found a jelly-like substance of about the circumference of a 25-cent piece. That, according to a communication from A.C. Twining to Professor Olmsted, a woman at West Point, New York, had seen a mass the size of a teacup. It looked like boiled starch. That, according to a newspaper of Newark, New Jersey, a mass of gelatinous substance like soft soap had been found. Quote, it possessed little elasticity, and on the application of heat, it evaporated as readily as water. End quote. It seems incredible that a scientist would have such a hardihood or infidelity as to accept that these things had fallen from the sky. Nevertheless, Professor Olmsted, who collected these lost souls, says, quote, the fact that the supposed deposits were so uniformly described as gelatinous substance forms a presumption in favour of the supposition that they had the origin ascribed to them. In contemporaneous scientific publications, considered attention was given to Professor Olmsted's series of papers upon the subject of the November meteors. You will not find one mention of the parts that treats of gelatinous matter. I'll tell you what, Brian, just pause from reading for a second. I was talking to my friend who's over from the UK now, He has to use a walking aid when he's back in the UK, and being out here, just being out here is enough for him to not need the walking aid. I'm exactly the same. When I'm in the UK, I'm in so much pain from all the injuries that I've sustained over the years. My hips, my knees, my ankles, my feet, my neck, my head, my shoulders, the back of my skull, everywhere is absolute agony because of the damp cold. Where I am now, here in Tenerife, just the weather, just the climate is enough to provide so much relief. You've got no idea how much damp coldness plays, how much of a part it plays in the pain. And climate, mate, is one of the best cures for those sorts of pains. That and RSO, CBD, and all that sort of stuff. Red Eye Jedi's good at making all that kind of stuff. You should get in touch with Red Eye. He's really good at that. Making munchies and stuff. Edibles. Right, back to the book. I shall attempt not much of correlation of dates. A mathematic-minded positivist, with his delusion that in an intermediate state twice 2 are 4, whereas if we accept continuity, we cannot accept that there are anywhere 2 things to start with. We search our data for periodicities, crikey. Sorry, live reading, remember. It is so obvious to me that the mathematic, or the regular, is the attribute of the universal, that I have not much inclination to look for it in the local. Still, in this solar system, quote, as a whole, end quote, there is considerable approximation to regularity. Or the mathematic is so nearly localized that it eclipses, for instance, can, with rather high approximation, be foretold, though I have notes that would deflate a little the astronomer's vainglory in this respect, or would that it were possible, or would if that were possible. Jesus, this guy's use of English is interesting. He lives upon his own inflations. Deflate a bear and it couldn't hibernate. This solar system is like every other phenomenon that can be regarded as a whole. All the affairs of a ward are interfered with by the affairs of the city of which it is a part. City by county, county by state, state by nation, nation by other nations, all nations by climatic conditions, climatic conditions by solar circumstances, sun by general planetary circumstances, solar system as a whole by other solar systems. So the hopelessness of finding the phenomena of entirety in the ward of a city. But positivists are those who try to find the unrelated in the ward of a city. In our acceptance, this is the spirit of cosmic religion. Objectively, the state is not realizable in the ward of a city. But if a positivist could bring himself to absolute belief that he had found it, it would be a subjective realization of that which is unrealizable objectively. Of course, we do not draw a positive line between the objective and the subjective, or that all phenomena called things or persons are subjective within one all-inclusive nexus, and that thoughts within those that are commonly called persons are subjective. It is rather as if intermediateness, strove for regularity in this solar system and failed, then generated the mentality of astronomers, and, in that secondary expression, strove for conviction that failure had been success. Just going to pause for a second and just I wish this guy was sat in front of me now so I could say to him, or perhaps the entire model that you've got for a solar system is a load of bullwhack. So that's probably why your theories don't work there. I have tabulated all the data of this book and had a great deal besides. Card system and several proximities, thus emphasized, have been revelations to me. Nevertheless, it is only the method of theologians and scientists, worst of all, statisticians. For instance, by the statistic method, I could prove that a black rain has fallen regularly every 7 months somewhere upon this earth. To do it, I would have to include red rains and yellow rains, but conventionally I pick out the black particles in the red substances and in the yellow substances, disregard the rest. Then, too, if here and there where a black rain should be a week early or a month late, that would be acceleration or retardation. This is supposed to be legitimate in working out the periodicities of comets. If black rains, or red or yellow rains with black particles in them, should not appear at all near some dates, we have not read Darwin in vain. Quote, the records are not complete. End quote. As to other interfering black rains, they'd be either grey or brown. On for them, we'd find other periodicities. Still, I have had to notice in the year 1819, for instance, I shall not note them all in this book, but I have records of 31 extraordinary events in 1883. Someone should write a book upon the phenomena of this one year. That is, if books should be written. 1849 is notable for extraordinary falls, so far apart that a local explanation seems inadequate. Not only the Black Rain of Ireland, May 1849, but a red rain in Sicily and a red rain in Wales. Also, it is said in Tim's yearbook, 1850, that upon April 18th or 20th, 1849, shepherds near Ararat found a substance that was not indigenous upon areas measuring 8 to 10 miles in circumference. Presumably, it had fallen there. We have already gone into the subject of science and its attempted positiveness and its resistances, and that it must have relations of service. It is very easy to see that most of the theoretic science of the 19th century was only a relation of reaction against theologic dogma. It has no more to do with the truth than has a wave that bounds back from a shore. Or if a shop girl, or you, or I, should pull out a piece of chewing gum about a yard long, that would be quite as scientific a performance as was the stretching of this Earth's age several hundred millions of years. All things are not things, but only relations, or expressions of relations. But all relations are striving to be the unrelated, or have surrendered to and subordinated to higher attempts. So there is a positive aspect to this reaction that is itself only a relation, and that is the attempt to assimilate all phenomena under the materialist explanation, as to formulate a final, all-inclusive system upon the materialist basis. If this attempt could be realized, that would be the attaining of realness. But this attempt can be made only by disregarding psychic phenomena. For instance, or if science shall eventually give in to the psychic, it would be no more legitimate to explain the immaterial in terms of the material than to explain the material in terms of the immaterial. Our own acceptance is that material and immaterial are of a oneness, merging, for instance, in a thought that is continuous with the physical action. That oneness cannot be explained, because the process of explaining is the interpreting of something in terms of something else. All explanation is assimilation of something in terms of something else that has been taken as a basis. But in continuity, there is nothing that is more basic than anything else. Unless we think that delusion built upon delusion is less real than its pseudo-foundation. In 1829, in Tim's yearbook, Timbs, yearbook 1848, in Persia fell a substance that the people said that they had never seen before. As to what it was, they had not a notion, but they saw that the sheep ate it. They ground it into flour and made bread, said to have been passable enough, though insipid. There was a chance that science did not neglect. Manna was placed upon a reasonable basis, or was assimilated into and reconciled with a system that had ousted the older and less nearly real system. It was said that, likely enough, manna had fallen in ancient times because it was still falling, and that there was no tutelary influence behind it, that it was a lichen from the steppes of Asia Minor, quote, up from one place in a whirlwind and down in another place, end quote. The American Almanac 1833, it is said that this substance, quote, unknown to the inhabitants of the region, end quote, was immediately recognized by scientists who examined it. That, quote, the chemical analysis also identified it as lichen, end quote. This was back in the days when chemical analysis was God. Since then, his devotees have been shocked and disillusioned. Just how a chemical analysis could so botanize, I don't know. It was chemical analysis who spoke, and spoke dogmatically. It seems to me that the ignorance of inhabitants, contrasting with the local knowledge of foreign scientists, is overdone. If there's anything good to eat, within any distance conveniently covered by a whirlwind, inhabitants know it. I have data of other fools, in Persia and Asiatic Turkey, of edible substances. They are all dogmatically said to be manna, and manna is dogmatically said to be a species of lichens from the steppes of Asia Minor. The position that I take is that this explanation was evolved in ignorance of the fall of vegetable substances or edible substances in other parts of the world. That it is the familiar attempt to explain the general in terms of the local. That if we shall have data of falls of vegetable substance in, say, Canada or India, they were not of lichens from the steppes of Asia Minor. That, though it falls in Asia, Turkey and Persia, are sweepingly and conveniently called showers of manna, they have not been all of the same substance. In one instance, the particles are said to have been seeds, though in Comptus Rendus, the substance that fell in 1841 and 1846 is said to have been gelatinous. In the Bull Scientific the bull.sci.nat, the Neuchatel, is said to have been of something in lumps the size of a filbert that had been ground into flour, that of this flour had been made bread, very attractive looking, but flavourless. It is difficult to explain segregation in these showers, but deep-sea fishes and occasional falls down to them of edible substances, bags of grain, barrels of flour, things that had not been whirled up from one part of the ocean bottom in storms or the submarine disturbances and dropped somewhere else. I suppose one thinks, but grain in bags has never fallen. Object of Amherst. Its covering like milled cloth, or barrels of corn lost from a vessel would not sink, but a host of them clashing together after a wreck, they burst open. The corn sinks, or does when saturated. The barrel staves float longer. If there had not been an overhead traffic in commodities similar to our own commodities carried over this Earth's oceans, I'm not the deep-sea fish I think I am. I have no data other than the mere suggestion of the Amherst objects of bags or barrels, but my notion is that bags and barrels from a wreck on one of this Earth's oceans would, by the time they reach the bottom, no longer be recognizable as bags or barrels. That if we can have data of the fall of fibrous material that may have been cloth or paper or wood, we shall be satisfactory and grotesque enough. Mighty Atom, how you doing, mate? In the year 1686, quote, in the year 18... Oh, for crying out loud. Quote, in the year 1686, some workmen who had been fetching water from a pond 7 German miles from Memel, on returning to their work after dinner, during which there had been a snowstorm, found the flat ground around and the pond covered with a coal-like leafy mass. And a person who lived near said he had seen it fall like flakes with the snow. Some of these flake-like formations were as large as a tabletop. Quote, the mass was damp and smelled disagreeably, like rotten seaweed, but when dried the smell went off. End quote. Quote, it tore fibrously like paper. End quote. Classic explanation. Quote, up from one place and down in another. End quote. What went up from one place in a whirlwind? Of course, our intermediatist acceptance is that had this been the strangest substance conceivable, from the strangest other world that could be thought of, somewhere upon this earth where there must be a substance similar to it, or from which it would, at least subjectively or according to description, not be easily distinguishable, or that everything in New York City is only another degree or aspect of something, or combination of things, in a village of Central Africa. The novel is a challenge to vulgarization. Write something that looks new to you. Someone will point out that the thrice accursed Greeks said it long ago. Existence is appetite, the gnaw of being, the one attempt of all things to assimilate all other things. If they have not surrendered and submitted to some higher attempt. It was cosmic that these scientists, who had surrendered to and submitted to the scientific system, should, constantly with the principles of that system, attempt to assimilate the substance that fell at Memel with some known terrestrial product. At the meeting of the Royal Irish Academy, it was brought out there that there is a substance of rather rare occurrence that has been known to form in thin sheets upon marshland, It looks like greenish felt, the substance of memel, damp, coal-black leafy mass, but if broken up, the marsh-like substance is flake-like and tears fibrously. An elephant can be identified as a sunflower. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry. An elephant can be identified as a sunflower. Both have long stems. A camel is indistinguishable from a peanut, if only their humps be considered. Trouble with this book is that we'll end up a lot of intellectual rows. We'll be incapable of being astonished with anything. We knew to start with that science and imbecility are continuous. Nevertheless, so many expressions of the merging point are at first startling. We did think that Professor Hitchcock's performance in identifying the Amherst phenomenon as a fungus was rather notable as scientific vaudeville. If we acquit him of the charge of seriousness, or that in a place where fungi were so common that before a given evening 2 of them sprang up, only he, a stranger in this very fungiferous place, knew a fungus when he saw something like a fungus. If we disregard its quick liquefaction, for instance, it was only a monologue. However, now we have an all-star cast, and they're not only Irish, they're Royal Irish. The Royal Irishman excluded coal blackness and included fibrousness. So then that this substance was marsh paper, which had been, quote, raised into the air by storms of wind and had again fallen, end quote. Second act. It was said that, according to Mr. Ehrenberg, quote, the meteor paper was found to consist partly of vegetable matter, chiefly of coniferae, end quote. Third act, meeting of the Royal Irishman, chairs, table, Irishman, some flakes of marsh paper were exhibited. Their composition was chiefly of coniferae. It was a double inclusion. This was a double inclusion. Or it's the method of agreement that logicians make so much of. No logician would be satisfied with identifying a peanut as a camel because both have humps. He demands accessory agreement that both can live a long time without water, for instance. Now, it's not so very unreasonable, at least to the free and easy vaudeville standards, that throughout this book we are considering to think that a green substance could be snatched up from one place in a whirlwind and fall as a black substance somewhere else. But the Royal Irishman excluded something else, and it is a datum that was as accessible to them as it is to me. That, according to Chladni, this was no little local deposition that was seen to occur by some indefinite person living near a pond somewhere. It was a tremendous fall from a vast sky area. Likely enough, all the marsh paper in the world could not have supplied it. At the same time, the substance was falling, quote, in great quantities, end quote, in Norway and Pomerania. Or see Kirkwood, Meteoric Astronomy, page 66. Quote, Substance like charred paper fell in Norway and other parts of Northern Europe, January 31st, 1686. End quote. Or a whirlwind, with the distribution as wide as that, would not acceptably, I should say, have so specialised in the rare substance called marsh paper. There'd have been falls of fence rails and roofs as houses, parts of trees. Nothing is said of the occurrence of a tornado in Northern Europe in January 1686. There is record only of this one substance having fallen in various places. Time went on, but the conventional determination to exclude data of all falls to this earth, except of substances of this earth and of ordinary meteoric matter, strengthened. The Annals of Philosophy, 16-68. The substance that fell in January 1686 is described as a mass of black leaves having the appearance of burnt paper, but harder and cohering and brittle. Quote, marsh paper, end quote, is not mentioned, and there is nothing said of coniferae, which seemed so convincing to the Royal Irishman. Vegetable composition is disregarded, quite as it might be by someone who might find it convenient to identify a crook-necked squash as a big fish hook. Brian Evans, that is because of social programming. The cartoons that we used to watch, especially the cartoons from the 60s and 70s, had stereotypical hula girls with coconuts where the boobies should be. Meteorites are usually covered with a black crust, more or less scale-like. The substance of 1686 is black and scale-like. If so be convenience, leaf-likeness is scale-likeness. In this attempt to assimilate with the conventional, we are told that the substance is a mineral mass, that it is like the black scales that cover meteorites. The scientist who made this identification was von Grothus. He had appealed to the god chemical analysis, or the power and glory of mankind, with which we're not always so impressed, that the gods must tell us what we want them to tell us. We see again that, though nothing has identity of its own, anything can be identified as anything. Or, there's nothing that's not reasonable, if one snoopeth not into its exclusions. But here, the conflict did not end. Basilius examined the substance. He could not find nickel in it. At that time, the presence of nickel was the positive test of meteoritic matter, whereupon, with a superstitious positive standard of judgment against him, von Grothus revoked his identification. This equalization of eminences permits us to project with our own expression, which otherwise would be subdued into invisibility. That it's too bad that no one ever looked to see hieroglyphs? Something written upon these sheets of paper? If we have no very great variety of substances that have fallen to this earth, if upon this earth's surface there is infinite variety of substances detachable by whirlwinds, two falls of such a rare substance as marsh paper would be remarkable. A writer in the Edinburgh Review, 87 to 194, says that at the time of writing he had before him a portion of a sheet of 200 square feet of a substance that had fallen at Karolath, Silesia, in 1839, exactly similar to cotton felt, of which clothing might have been made. The god microscopic examination had spoken. The substance consisted chiefly of coniferae. Coniferae. Conifervae. Conifervae. Vae. The Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1847. That March 16th, 1846, about the time of a fall of edible substance in Asia Minor, an olive grey powder fell at Shanghai. Under the microscope, it was seen to be an aggregation of hairs of two kinds, black ones and rather thick white ones. They were supposed to be mineral fibres, but when burned, they gave out the, quote, the common ammoniacal smell and smoke of burnt hair or feathers, end quote. The writer ascribed the phenomena as, quote, a cloud of 3,800 square miles of fibres, alkali and sand, end quote. In a postscript, he says that other investigators with more powerful microscopes gave opinion that the fibres were not hairs, and that the substance consisted chiefly of coniferae. Coniferae. Or the pathos of it, perhaps, or the dull and inspired but courageous persistence of the scientific. Everything seemingly found out is doomed to be subverted by more powerful microscopes and telescopes, by more refined, precise searching means and methods. The new pronouncements irrepressibly bobbing up, their reception always as truth at last, always the illusion of the final, very little of the intermediatist spirit. That the new that has displaced the old will itself someday be displaced, that it too will be recognized as myth stuff, but that if phantoms climb, spooks of ladders are good enough for them. Sergeant Bun, how you doing, mate? The Annual Register, 1821. That, according to a report by M. Lane, French consul at Bernambucou, early in October 1821, there was a shower of a substance resembling silk. The quantity was as tremendous as might be a whole cargo, lost somewhere between Jupiter and Mars, having drifted around perhaps for centuries. The original fabrics slowly disintegrating. In Annales de Chimie, it is said that samples of this substance were sent to France by M. Lane, and that they proved to have some resemblances to silky filaments, which at certain times of the year are carried by the wind near Paris. In the Annals of Philosophy, there is mention of a fibrous substance like blue silk that fell near Naumburg, March 23rd, 1665. According to Chladni, Annals de Chimie, the quantity was great. He places a question mark before the date. One of the advantages of intermediatism is that in the oneness of quasiness, there can be no mixed metaphors. Whatever is acceptable of anything is, in some degree or aspect, acceptable of everything. So it is quite proper to speak, for instance, of something that is firm as a rock, and that sails in a majestic march. The Irish are good monists. They have, of course, been laughed at for their keener perceptions. So it's a book we're writing, or it's a procession, or it's a museum, with the Chamber of Horrors rather overemphasized. A rather horrible correlation occurs in the Scientific American 1859. What interests us is that a correspondent saw a silky substance fall from the sky. There was an aurora borealis at the time. He attributes the substance to the aurora. Since the time of Darwin, the classic explanation has been that all silky substances that fall from the sky are spiders' webs. In 1832, aboard the Beagle, at the mouth of the La Plata River, 60 miles from land, Darwin saw an enormous number of spiders, of the kind usually known as gossamer spiders, little aeronauts that cast out filaments by which wind carries them. It's difficult to express that silky substances have fallen to this earth were not spiders' webs. My own acceptance is that spiders' webs are the merger, that there have been falls of externally derived silky substance, and also of the webs, or strands rather, of aeronautic spiders indigenous to this earth. That in some substances it is possible to distinguish one from the other. Of course, our expression upon silky substances will merge away into expressions upon another seeming textile substances. And I don't know how much better off we'll be, except that if fabricable materials have fallen from the sky, simply to establish acceptance of that may be doing well enough in this book of first and tentative explorations. In All Year Round, 8-254 is described a fall that took place in England, September 21st, 1741, in the towns of Bradley, Selborne and Alresford, and in a triangular space included by these three towns. The substance is described as cobwebs, but it fell in flake formation, or in flakes or rags about 1 inch broad and about 5 or 6 inches long. Also, these flakes were of relatively heavy substance. They fell with some velocity. The quantity was great. The shortest side of the triangular space is 8 miles long. In the Wanerian National History Society, it is said that there were 2 falls, that they were some hours apart, a datum that is becoming familiar to us, a datum that cannot be taken into the fold unless it is repeated over and over and over and over again. It is said that the second fall lasted from 9 o'clock in the morning until night. Now, the hypnosis of the classic, that what we call intelligence is only an expression of it in equilibrium, and that when mental adjustments are made, intelligence ceases, or, of course, that intelligence is the confession of ignorance. If you have intelligence upon any subject, that is something you're still learning. If we agree that that which is learned is always mechanically done, in quasi-terms, of course, because nothing is ever finally learned. It was decided that this substance was spider's web. That was adjustment. But it's not adjustment to me. So I'm afraid that I shall have some intelligence in this matter. If I ever arrive at adjustment upon this subject, then, upon this subject, I shall be able to have no thoughts, except routine thoughts. I haven't yet quite decided about absolutely everything, so I'm able to point out that this substance was of quantity so enormous that it attracted wide attention when it came down, that it would have been equally noteworthy when it went up, that there is no record of anyone in England or elsewhere having seen tons of spiderwebs going up in September 1741. Further confession of intelligence upon my part, that, if it be contested, then that the place of origin might have been far away, but still terrestrial. Then it's that other familiar matter of incredible marksmanship again, hitting a small triangular space for hours, interval of hours, and then from 9 in the morning until night, same small triangular space. These are the disregards of the classic explanation. There is no mention of spiders having been seen to fall, but a good inclusion is that though this substance fell in good-sized flakes of considerable weight, it was viscous. In this respect, it was like cobwebs. Dog-nosing it on grass, we were blindfolded with it. This circumstance does strongly suggest cobwebs. Unless we accept that in regions aloft there are vast viscous or gelatinous areas and that things passing through become daubed. Or perhaps we clear up the confusion in the descriptions of the substance that fell in 1841 and 1846 in Asia Minor, described in one publication as gelatinous and in another as cereal. That it was a cereal that had passed through a gelatinous region. That the paper-like substance of memel may have such an experience be indicated that Ehrenberg found in it gelatinous matter, which he called nostoc. Scientific American. Fall of a substance described as cobwebs, latter part of October 1881. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and other towns mentioned are Green Bay, Vassburg, Fort Howarth, Sheboygan, and Ozaukee. The aeronautic spiders, known as gossamer spiders, because of the extreme lightness of the filaments that they cast out to the wind, of the substance that fell in Wisconsin, it is said, quote, in all instances the webs were strong in texture and very white, end quote. The editor says, quote, curiously enough, there is no mention in any of the reports that we have seen of the presence of spiders, end quote. So our attempt to divorce a possible external product from its terrestrial merger, then our joy of the prospector who thinks he's found something. The monthly weather review, 25-566, quotes the Montgomery Advertiser that upon 21st of November 1898, numerous batches of spider web-like substance fell in Montgomery, in strands and in occasional masses several inches long and several inches broad. According to the writer, it was not a spider's web, but something like asbestos, also that was phosphorescent. The editor of the review says that he sees no reason for doubting that these masses are cobwebs. La Nature, 1883. A correspondent writes that he sends a sample of a substance said to have fallen at Montesson, Gironde, October 16, 1883. According to a witness quoted by the correspondent, a thick cloud accompanied by rain and a violent wind had appeared. This cloud was composed of a woolly substance in lumps the size of a fist, which fell to the ground. The editor, Tissandier, said of this substance that it was white, but was something that had been burned. It was fibrous. Monsieur Tissandier astonishes us by saying that he cannot identify the substance. We thought that anything could be identified as anything. He can say only that the cloud in question must have been an extraordinary conglomeration. Annual Register, 1832. That March 1832 there fell in the fields of Koryanov, Russia, a combustible yellowish substance, covering at least 2 inches thick, an area of 600 or 700 square feet. It was resinous and yellowish, so one inclines to the conventional explanation that it was pollen from pine trees, but when torn, it had the tenacity of cotton. When placed in water, it had the consistency of resin. Quote, this resin had the color of amber, was elastic like Indian rubber, and smelled like prepared oil mixed with wax, end quote. So in general, our notion of cargoes and our notion of cargoes of food supplies, in Philosophical Transactions 19-224, is an extract of a letter by Mr. Robert Vans of Kilkenny, Ireland, dated November 15th, 1695. That there had been of late in the counties of Limerick and Tipperary showers of a sort of matter like butter or grease, having a very stinking smell. There follows an extract from a letter by the Bishop of Cloyne upon, quote, a very odd phenomenon, quote, which was observed in Munster and Leinster. and that for a good part of the spring of 1695 there fell a substance which the country people called butter, soft, clammy, and of a dark yellow, that cattle fed indifferently in fields where this substance lay. It fell in lumps as big as the end of one's finger, and it had a strong, ill scent. His Grace calls it stinking dew. In Mr. Van's letter, it is said that the butter was supposed to have medicinal properties and was gathered in pots and other vessels by some of the inhabitants of this place. And in all the following volumes of the Philosophical Transactions, there is no speculation upon this extraordinary subject. Ostracism. The fate of this datum is a good instance of damnation, not by denial and not by explaining away, but by simple disregard. The fool is listed by Chladni and is mentioned in other catalogues, but from the absence of all inquiry and of all but formal mention, we see that it has been under excommunication as much as was ever anything by the preceding system. The datum has been buried alive. It is as irreconcilable within the modern system of dogmas as ever were geologic strata and vermiform appendage with the preceding system, if intermittently or for a good part of the spring this substance fell in 2 Irish provinces and nowhere else, we have, stronger than before, the sense of a stationary region overhead, or a region that receives products like this Earth's products but from external sources, a region in which this Earth's gravitational and meteorological forces are relatively inert. If for many weeks a good part of this substance did hover before finally falling, we suppose that in 1685 Mr. Vans and the Bishop of Cloyne could describe what they saw as well as could any witness in 1885. Nevertheless, it is going far back. We shall have to have many modern instances before we can accept. As to other fools, or another fool, it is said in the American Scientific Journal that April 1832, about a month after the fall of the substance of Koryanov, fell a substance that was wine yellow, transparent, soft, and smelled like rancid oil. Monsieur Hermann, a chemist who examined it, named it sky oil. For analysis and chemic reactions, see the journal. The Edinburgh New Philosophical Journal mentions an unctuous substance that fell near Rotterdam in 1832. In Comptes Rendus 13-215, there is an account of an oily reddish matter that fell at Genoa, February 1841. Whatever it may have been, altogether most of our difficulties are problems that should leave to later developers of supergeography. I think a discoverer of America should leave Long Island to someone else. If there he, plying back and forth from Jupiter and Mars and Venus, superconstructions that are sometimes wrecked, we think of fuel as well as cargoes. Of course, the most convincing data would be of coal falling from the sky. Nevertheless, one does suspect that oil-burning engines were discovered ages ago in more advanced worlds. But, as I say, we should leave something to our disciples. So we'll not especially wonder why these butter-like or oily substances were food or fuel. So we merely note in the Scientific American that in the Scientific American is an account of hail that fell in the middle of April 1871 in Mississippi, in which was a substance described as turpentine. Hail and ashes in Ireland, 1755. That at Elizabeth, New Jersey, June 9th, 1874, fell hail in which was a substance said by Professor Leaves of the Stevens Institute to be a carbonate of soda. We are getting a little away from the lines of our composition, but it will be an important point later that so many extraordinary falls have occurred with hail, or, if they were of substances that had had origin upon some other part of this earth's surface, had the hail too that origin? Our acceptance here will depend upon the number of instances. Reasonably enough, some of the things that fall to this earth should coincide with falls of hail. As to vegetable substances, in quantities so great as to suggest lost cargoes, we have a note in the Intellectual Observer that upon the 1st of May 1863, a rain fell at Perpignan, quote, bringing down with it a red substance which proved on examination to be red meal mixed with fine sand, end quote. At various points along the Mediterranean this substance fell. There is, in Philosophical Transactions, an account of a seeming cereal said to have fallen in Wiltshire, and 1686 said that some of the wheat fell in enclosed in hailstones, but the writer in Transactions said that he had examined the grains and that they were nothing but seeds of ivy berries dislodged from holes and chinks where birds had hidden them. If birds still hide ivy seeds, and if winds still blow, I don't see why the phenomena has not repeated in more than 200 years since. Or the red matter in rain at Siena, Italy, May 1830, said by Arago to have been vegetable matter. Somebody should collect data of the falls at Siena alone. In the monthly Weather Review, a correspondent writes that upon February 16, 1901, at Paw Paw, Michigan, upon a day that was so calm that his windmill did not run, fell a brown dust that looked like vegetable matter. The editor of the review concludes that this was no widespread fall from a tornado because it had been reported from nowhere else. Rancidness, putridity, decomposition, a note that has been struck many times. In a positive sense, of course, nothing means anything, or every meaning is continuous with all other meanings, or that all evidences of guilt, for instance, are just as good evidences of innocence. But this condition seems to mean things lying around among the stars for a long time. Horrible disaster in the time of Julius Caesar remains from it not reaching this earth till the time of the Bishop of Cloyne. We leave to later research the discussion of bacterial action and decomposition, and whether bacteria could survive in what we call space, of which we know nothing. Chemical news. Dr. A.T. Machati, FCS, writes that at London, Ontario, February 24th, 1868, in a violent storm, fell with snow a dark-coloured substance, estimated at 500 tons, over a belt 50 miles by 10 miles. It was examined under a microscope by Dr. Machati, who found it to consist mainly of vegetable matter, quote, far advanced in decomposition, end quote. The substance was examined by Dr. James Adams of Glasgow, who gave his opinion that it was the remains of cereals. Dr. Machati points out that this was for months before this fall on the ground of Canada had been frozen, so that in this case a more than ordinary remote origin has to be thought of. Dr. Machati thinks of origin to the south. However, he says, this is mere conjecture. That March 24th, 1840, during a thunderstorm at Rajkot, India, occurred a fall of grain. It was reported by Colonel Sykes of the British Association. The natives were greatly excited because it was grain of a kind unknown to them. Usually comes forward a scientist who knows more of the things that natives know best than the natives know. But it so happens that the usual thing was not done definitely in this instance. Quote, the grain was shown to some botanists who did not immediately recognize it, but thought it to be either a spartium or a vicia. End quote. Lead, silver, diamonds, and glass. Right, I'm gonna. How long have I been going? Well, hour and 20 minutes. Do you know what? Crikey, we've got 10 people. 10 people listening. Nobody's chatting really. Just JP, Brian Evans. I don't know if anybody's still there, JP. not chatting. I'm going to take a break because this book it's not easy to read, you know. And I'll be back soon to read some more. We're on page 60 something. There's 257 pages. So we're about a fifth of the way through it. So keep your eyes peeled. I will be back to continue with more. Thank you very much.